This is Todd Wall of Aquatongue Media. I wanted to review an article in Cap City News titled BLM Wins Two Lawsuits Clearing Way for Elimination of Two Wyoming Wild Horse Herds. In this instance, BLM stands for Bureau of Land Management, not the more famous BLM for which that acronym is more widely known. The article begins, "That's a lot of horses," lamented Cheyenne resident Robin Smith from a high desert ridgeline. It wasn't her first exasperated exclamation. Crap was her immediate reaction to learning a federal judge had given the Bureau of Land Management the okay to proceed with plans to fully remove two wild horse herds from the landscape in southwest Wyoming. A retired architect donning a Freedom to Return ball cap that featured a bucking Mustang, Smith proudly described herself as a wild horse advocate. On this crisp Thursday morning in the hill country north of Interstate 80, she was doing one of her favorite things, watching Mustangs. Smith's interest in the equines, an icon of the West, albeit a non-native one, had evolved organically into activism, stemming from a wildlife photography hobby. "We started doing more horse photography," she said, and then we started wondering, well, what do you mean you're going to round them up? The thing about these horses, I'll have to say it's interesting. I don't know that you would have other animals that would garner as much appreciation. Horses, obviously wild horses, are very iconic, very beautiful in fact, and I think this in part feeds some of the interest in them and some of the activism you see in terms of people trying to keep wild horses and maintain wild horse herds in the West. The article continues. Soon Smith invested enough that she was sitting through wild horse-related legal proceedings and traveling to observe roundups, government-run wild horse gatherers, exactly like what was happening in the distance. And so there's a picture in the article. Someone's looking on with, it looks like binoculars, and they're looking at a helicopter that's bearing down on a wild horse herd, attempting to capture them and round them up. While Smith and a dozen or so others watched on for hours, a helicopter commissioned by the Bureau of Land Management herded one band of horses, then another, towards a trap. Once inside, they were sorted and trucked away. I do imagine this has to be pretty traumatic for a wild horse that's lived basically really outside of human contact for its entire life to face that kind of stress. I'm sure that is very stressful for these animals. The animals were members of what BLM considers the White Mountain Herd. It's vastly overpopulated, at least going back by what federal agencies consider an appropriate number for this landscape. By day's end, 144 animals, 52 stallions, 63 mares, and 29 foals had been removed, which meant the two crews were almost exactly a quarter of the way towards their goal of taking 586 Mustangs off the range over the next couple of weeks. That's a very precise number. We don't know exactly, well, they're going to get into it. They're a little light in this article on the reasons that BLM might determine a horse population to be overpopulated. They don't go too much into it, which I think is unfortunate. I can imagine there's many things, in terms of lack of food, lack of water. But in any event, the article continues. The White Mountain Herd's horses are well known enough that they're being allowed to persist. BLM even advertises a scenic drive that winds through the heart of the herd management area. The plan is to maintain in the neighborhood of 205 to 300 horses in the region, which reaches from Rock Springs northwest to the National Wildlife Refuge. The Adobe Town Herd in the Red Desert is also being allowed to persist. BLM plans call for 225 to 450 horses there. The neighboring Salt Wells and Great Divide Basin herds, meanwhile, are slated for elimination. And so here in the article, they kind of talk a little bit, they kind of finally touch on some of the issues here. Wild horses compete with sheep, cattle, and native wildlife for forage and other resources. The fact is particularly problematic in the eyes of some, and a prime driver of horse policy in this checkerboard swath of southwest Wyoming, where federal and private lands interchange in square mile blocks that meet at the corners. The cattle and sheep-centric Rock Springs Grazing Association owns and leases about 1.1 million acres of private land in the checkerboard, and for decades fought BLM over wild horses. So if I'm reading this correctly, what it's basically saying is there's a region of Wyoming where you've got a checkerboard. And if you picture a checkerboard, one square would be private land, the next square would be public land. It's all unfenced, and what's happening is you have these herds of wild horses. Obviously, they don't know which part of the checkerboard is public and which part is private, and so obviously they're doing what horses do, and they're wandering around looking for food, and obviously they're grazing on private lands that are unfenced. So I guess this has caught the wrath of the Rock Springs Grazing Association. A year ago, the association sued, asking a court to compel federal land managers to remove free-ranging Mustangs from their unfenced land. After the BLM finalized an environmental impact statement calling for trimming the 2 herds and eliminating 2 others in spring 2023, a coalition of 11 wild horse advocates came together to file a suit of their own challenging the decision. U.S. District Court of Wyoming Judge Kelly Rankin, a Biden administration appointee, ruled in BLM's favor in both lawsuits on Wednesday. The court agrees wild horses are improperly maintained on private lands, but the court also basically said, and I'm kind of breezing through some of this, it's sort of a lengthy article, the court also says that immediate action didn't need to be taken. So as you go down, basically, these people don't like it. You can see here this picture of the horses are being rounded up or have been rounded up and are being transported in a vehicle. And below we can see this picture of some of these, I don't know if they'd be called activists. That might be too strong, but they basically they're concerned about the removal of the horses, the well-being of the horses, and so they're there to document these processes whereby the horses get rounded up. And here you can see another picture where there's a group standing with a lot of photography equipment sort of documenting what's happening, what's taking place during these roundups. So roundups could continue. BLM Wyoming stated that the study process in June proposing to remove 5,000 Mustangs from 3 of the 4 horse management areas in the Rock Springs field office, including 2 complete herd eliminations. With the appeal expected, though, it's unlikely the required environmental assessment will be completed anytime soon, Purdy said. That's not to say federal contractors will stop rounding up horses in the checkerboard anytime soon. And here's a picture of a helicopter basically kind of bearing down on these horses. And this must be, as I said earlier, this must be very terrifying for these horses that have experienced very minimal interaction with people up until this point in their lives. Nationally, BLM is aiming to take 20,000 wild horses off the landscape in 2024. Numbers have come down from the high point, but the current population of 74,000 horses in wild burrows nationwide is still nearly 3 times the appropriate management level, a dynamic that holds true in southwest Wyoming, where there are thousands more horses than the agency and many residents desire. Could BLM do a gather to bring these herds back down to the target population? I think we could, Purdy said, but I don't think we can zero out the herd because that's under litigation. Essentially, intensive roundups throughout the region could continue, and if they do, it'll put BLM in a better position to complete the whole herd removals if or when the litigation wraps up. For horse advocates, these roundups aren't especially fun. Descriptions like unspeakable and cruel were common among the observers. Cheyenne resident Barry Smith, Robin Smith's husband, couldn't even watch. I get too emotional, he explained from the cab of his SUV where he waited out the roundup. I am sure that watching this, depending upon your inclination, could be traumatic. I mean, I think it's traumatic for the horses. I think that's obvious they are going under a lot of stress. It's better than them being shot, I suppose. So, I don't know that there's any good solutions here or perfect solutions. Just probably, choosing among the least bad solution, I think. And unfortunately, these roundups are taking place. Some of the pilots are better than others, Barry Smith said. Some of them are pretty good, and if the horses slow down, they kind of hold back and stay higher. Others overrun them, I think. I guess he's referring to pilots of helicopters that fly very close to the horses, which would be very traumatizing for the horses. Jay Diawart of the BLM Rock Springs Field Office's Wild Horse and Burro Specialist was the man in charge. Thursday, while taking lunch in his pickup, he professed to having something in common with the wild horse advocates who kept an eye on the operation. That's his picture right there. He seems like a nice enough fella. I just like him. I love horses, Diawart said. I own them, I use them, I ride them. I just like it. He loved 7 previously Roundup Mustangs so much. In fact, he took them home. Some of these horses came from herds in line to be eliminated. Diawart hadn't yet caught up on the court ruling, having been tied up prepping for the weeks-long roundup, but it's a decision that could make him a busy man. So I thought this was an interesting article. It's easy to come to quick judgments. I think in particular it's easy to basically look at this as cruel or unnecessary. I think a lot of times people who don't have the background around animals probably tend to have more sympathy towards the animals, which is fine. But I think that in many cases, that there are decisions that need to be made. In some cases, these animals could be, I think herds could grow too large. I think if there's limited resources, you don't want, animals starving to death, you don't want them, if it's a very dry, hot summer, you don't want them basically having no water. If it's a very cold winter, they could freeze to death and not make it. So it's easy to basically think that the roundups are cruel. It could be, you can make a case it'd be cruel to leave the horses out to suffer on their own in inhospitable conditions. But in any event, I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you have any comments, please add them to the comment section below. Thanks.